So, let's talk about a name you've almost certainly heard, but maybe the story behind it is a little fuzzy. Saint Augustine. And trust me, this is way more than just a history lesson. It's the wild story of one man's journey from sinner to saint, a journey that literally changed the course of the Western world. All right, let's get right to it because this is where things get a little mixed up for a lot of people. When I say St. Augustine, what pops into your head first? A sunny, historic city in Florida, or some ancient philosopher with a long beard hunched over a scroll? Well, the answer is both. And yeah, they're connected, but probably not in the way you think. First up, the city. St. Augustine, Florida, and it's a big deal. It holds the title for the oldest continuously lived-in European-founded city in the mainland United States. Think about that. It was founded way back in 1565 by a Spanish admiral, and it was a super important military base for the Spanish Empire in the New World. Okay, now let's rewind, and I mean way back, to the man himself, Augustine of Hippo. He was born in 354 AD in North Africa, what we now call Algeria. So we're talking more than 1,200 years before the city in Florida was even a thought. So what's the connection? Well, it's pretty simple. The Spanish admiral, the guy who founded the city, first spotted the land on August 28th, and that just so happens to be the feast day of St. Augustine. So boom, he named the place in his honor. And this man he named it for, well, he was a total powerhouse of theology and philosophy whose life story is one of the most incredible transformations you'll ever hear. All right, so let's get into his story, starting with his youth. And let me tell you, this guy was no saint from the get-go. Not even close. He was a restless young man searching for answers in a world full of temptation. So, as a young student in the city of Carthage, Augustine lived it up. He later called it a hedonistic lifestyle, and he wrote all about it with a ton of regret in his famous autobiography, Confessions. And there's this one story that really gets to the heart of it all, the story of the stolen pears. He and his friends snuck into a neighbor's orchard and stole a bunch of pears. The crazy part? They weren't even hungry. They just did it for the thrill of doing something they knew was wrong. And that small act, it just haunted him. It forced him to ask a huge question. Why do we do bad things just for the sake of it? But here's the thing. Augustine wasn't just some wild partier. He had a brilliant mind. And when he was about 19, something happened that changed everything. He read a book by the Roman philosopher Cicero called Hortensius. Now, we don't have this book anymore. It's been lost to history. But for Augustine, it was like a lightning bolt. It ignited this burning, passionate search in him for philosophy, for wisdom, for some kind of absolute truth. And this quest for truth threw him into this massive internal conflict. See, he had these two big ideas pulling him in opposite directions. On one side, you had Christianity, the faith of his mother, Monica. It taught that there was one all-powerful, all-good God. But that raised that really tough question, right? If God is so good, where does evil come from? On the other side, you had a belief system called Manichaeism, and it offered a really simple answer. It basically said, look, good and evil are two equal and opposite forces, constantly at war. For a young guy wrestling with his own choices, that simple answer made a lot of sense, for about 9 years anyway. But that simple answer didn't stick. After nearly a decade, the cracks started to show, and that inner turmoil just kept growing, until it all came to a head in one of the most famous conversion stories in history. In his own words, he was in a state of utter crisis. He was just completely torn. He had his worldly desires, his career, his ambition, a long-term mistress, and then he had this deep, nagging craving for spiritual peace. His heart, as he put it, was in turmoil. So the big moment happens in a garden in Milan. He's totally distraught, practically weeping, and all of a sudden he hears a child's voice from a nearby house chanting over and over, "Tolle lege," which is Latin for take up and read. He took it as a sign from God. He saw a copy of St. Paul's letters lying nearby, grabbed it, and just opened it to a random page. His eyes landed right on a passage from Romans that basically told him to stop his life of debauchery and to put on the Lord Jesus Christ. And just like that, snap. In that instant, he said, all his doubts just melted away. And his whole experience leads to maybe his most famous quote of all time. It perfectly captures that feeling of finding what you've been looking for your whole life. He writes in Confessions, "For thou hast made us for thyself, and our hearts are restless till they rest in thee." I mean, wow. That one sentence just sums it all up, doesn't it? That universal human feeling of searching for something more. For Augustine, that long, restless search was finally over. Now, Augustine's conversion wasn't just a personal victory, it was a turning point for the whole world. The sinner who had spent years wrestling with life's biggest questions was now about to become the saint who would provide the answers for centuries to come. So, what about that massive problem of evil that had plagued him for so long? Well, he came up with a revolutionary solution. He completely rejected the idea that evil was its own force. Instead, he argued that evil isn't a thing at all. It's simply the absence of good, a corruption of what God created. The best way to think about it is like this. Darkness isn't a thing, right? It's just the absence of light. For Augustine, evil was the exact same. It's just a shadow where good is supposed to be. And he didn't just stick to these huge abstract ideas. He tackled really practical stuff too. Remember, he was living in the middle of the collapsing Roman Empire, so he developed what we now call the just war theory. He wasn't some warmonger. He thought war was a terrible, tragic necessity. But he argued that sometimes, to preserve peace and punish a really profound evil, a state could be morally justified in going to war, but only if it met a very strict set of criteria. And that idea still influences international law to this day. And of course, the book where he lays all this out is Confessions. It was a total game changer. It's widely seen as the very first true autobiography in the West. It gives us this unbelievably intimate look into the mind of someone from the 4th and 5th centuries. But it was way more than just a memoir. It was a kind of how-to guide for conversion based on his own journey, and the whole thing is written like one long personal prayer to God. It basically set the template for spiritual writing for 1,000 years. So how do all these pieces fit together? Augustine's journey from a troubled young man to an influential saint wasn't just a series of events. It was the raw material for his entire philosophy. This timeline really gives you a bird's-eye view of that incredible life. Born in North Africa, the wild youth in Carthage, the dramatic conversion at 32, his rise to become the bishop of Hippo, he wrote Confessions soon after becoming bishop, and then died in 430 AD as his city was literally under siege by the Vandals. What a life! And this right here is the ultimate takeaway. Augustine's philosophy wasn't born in some quiet, peaceful ivory tower. His ideas about evil, free will, justice, and grace came directly from his own painful, messy human experiences. His personal search for truth, his struggle with sin, and his final conversion, these are the battles that forged the very foundations of Western thought. Which leaves us with one last, powerful question. Augustine's story shows us that it wasn't a perfect life that made him a saint. It was his honest, brutal confrontation with his own flaws. His journey suggests that maybe true wisdom doesn't come from avoiding the darkness, but from wrestling with it until you find the light.